Good morning.
I see how you doing, bud.
Good.
Hey, we're at the start of our slot, so we only have like 1 hour. So maybe let's get started there. So you have landed into the Lsvr working group, and we have a few interesting topics here. Now, before we start, let me see if my slides actually work. Okay. So we don't need the scribe thing because we have the scribe automatically built into the tool nowadays, which is very handy. If there are like any minutes, then please feel free to use the minute tab on top of the Meet Echo screen. You don't have to do this just by yourself. We can actually all do this together, so that's very handful, very handy and very convenient. So that will be appreciated. Next is, you have seen this note well already a few times because we're already on the second day. If any questions, please be aware of this. Then the agenda bashing. So what we have on the agenda at this point in time is three main topics here. First, we're going to get like an L3DL status update. Then we're going to have Paul speaking a bit about LDP v2, which is what is happening in the IEEE from that perspective. Then we're going to be discussing the enhancements and the progress around the BGP SPF draft itself and see where we are. And then we are going to be closing. So where are we within our working group here? So we have sent 2 documents towards the AD. The AD reviewed it and actually sent it back. But together when sending it back, he actually sent it back with like 1,001 pages of feedback, which the authors have been working upon very intensively over the New Year's period until now. And AC is going to give like an update on where we are at this point in time with these particular drafts. Now, in the meantime, also last month we have done a working group last call on the L3DL documents. While no major concerns were raised, there was also not really a lot of feedback on that. So, we need to figure out how to deal with that going forward. Now, that being said, there is another element playing also, and that has to do with the fact that L3DL is a little bit out of scope from our charter. So what we are thinking about doing is to recharter the working group by explicitly adding the L3DL components into the charter itself, which would give us a better foundation to keep progressing on this particular technology going forward. And that being said, in an effort for trying to enhance the feedback required, feedback requested and reviews requested for these documents, I will also be launching a call on the working group email alias for some volunteers to actually give feedback on these documents, just to trigger more discussions on that going forward. You have anything to add on this, Victor?
Pretty much covers it. So, sorry, no, that covers it from my perspective as well.
Okay, so yeah, I already talked about the IEEE status element here, which Paul is going to give us an update about. So going back to the agenda, anybody wants to add or change something on here at this point in time? If not, I think then we're going to be starting with the first session, the first slot from Randy. Okay, so let me pull up the slides for Randy. Voila. So Randy, if you can push the microphone button, then the floor or the worldwide internet is all yours at this point in time.
Well, I could only use this very small portion of the internet. Okay, Sue raised an issue via private email, which was interesting. But first, just a little bit more on status is the documents, the 3 L3DL documents passed within the last call with, as Gunther said, light feedback. But you should be aware that also that Rob is contemplating updating the LSOE open source implementation to L3DL. So that kind of wraps the status. So Sue raised an issue about the Hello PDU possibly causing a layer 2 storm. Next slide, please. If you remember, the Hello is a multicast layer 2 PDU being sent from a device who wakes up and is seeking friendship. There are two forms the PDU can take. One is that first MAC, which is stopped dead at the nearest bridge by layer 2 rules. Okay? If, just in case, there's an intermediate switch, we specified a to be assigned MAC that will pierce an intermediate switch, because by layer 2 rules, when a switch receives a frame with a multicast dest that it doesn't recognize, it forwards. Okay, so the second one is to be used when you know you're connected to a switch. Next slide, please. So the document says that that hello should be repeated at a configured interval with a default of 60 seconds. So when a device wakes up, it should find its friends within a mean of 30 seconds and a max of 60 seconds. But it further warns that if you're in the multi-link scenario, in other words, you're allowing for intermediate switches, be aware of a trade-off between a timer tuning and network noise, and maybe tune the timer up or down accordingly. But Sue raised a further issue. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I've stolen her artwork. Sue, do you want to walk through the storm, or shall I do it? I think everybody knows what a layer 2 storm is like, so we can breeze through the storm, as it were. Or we can, if you've got the patience, you can take us through it. Your mic's on, but I don't hear you.
Back. That means because they need to enable me. Did you get me? Can you hear me?
Gotcha.
Yeah, we
I
hear
hear
you.
you.
Yes.
Okay. I would go through the brief, because if people understand multicast storms, this may be a simple issue. If the brief doesn't make it, we'll go through the more lengthy approach. So, folks, the diagram I'll explain, and then I'm going to let Randy go through the discussion, because he tends to be a bit briefer than I. The concept is you don't have the topology described in the document. Okay, and Randy will go through it, but you have this more interconnected switch topology. How you got there, not my problem. Perhaps it's recon errors. And so this is the error topology. Note, I realize it is not a standard class topology. It would be created by error or by something else. So, Randy, why don't you go ahead, or I can explain the next set. Next slide.
It's fine. It's fine. So essentially, the routers, things labeled routers, are L3DL speakers. The things not labeled routers, the little square cubes, oops, that's bad. The little cubes are switches. Whereas if you use the multicast to be assigned, multicast packets will go not only through them, but it will, as it receives one, next slide please, it will re-announce it. Okay, you see the multicast hello coming up from router A and switch 1 re-announcing that on all its other interfaces. Next slide, please. Those other destinations generously do similarly. And we can see more pretty colored little boxes multiplying in the network. Next slide, please. Those in turn echo back. Now what was fun here is that because the echoes caused regeneration, they go back, they're allowed to come back through the mesh and are even worse. Next slide, please. So I think you see where this is going. If anybody wants more detail on layer 2 storms, feel free to hit your mic button. Bill. Bill?
Hi. You have a layer 2 network without spanning tree, but with loops? Like, how do you get to this point where the switches are flooding and creating a storm?
That's a good point. This is an edge case, Bill. The spanning tree is most likely not running. You would have some interconnections that are normal. So as I started out in the beginning, this broadcast storm only works with a set of edge cases. Okay, you don't have something that's running a spanning tree. You're using the multicast transmission, which goes through switches and then redistributes widely. Paul, I don't know if this is even possible in the current thing.
Just, Bill, let me see if I can cut to the chase here. Excuse the spoiler. The final scene of the movie is, this isn't our envisioned topology in this working group. This isn't a club. And there's tons of intermediate switches which we don't envision. We envision LSVR enabled devices, all on link to link. Just in case, we can move forward. Let me move forward. Next slide, please.
I think we also have Paul actually in the line here. I'm
Sorry,
not really
Paul.
sure if it...
Yeah, I just was going to echo kind of what Bill said. We have it obviously kind of an invalid layer 2 topology here. There's, besides multicast, there would be other flooded packets that were not learned yet or various things. So I also wanted to point out, spanning tree is not your only topology management protocol at layer 2. There's other approaches, including software-defined networking things, or as well as shortest path bridging. And so to make this work, there must be some kind of loop-free topology management going on that would prevent this. I mean,
Yeah, my point is, I don't want to make it work. I don't think we're interested in it, but I'll get there in a minute. Next slide, please. Okay. One approach, aside from, as Paul and Fenron point out, try to use standard layer 2 damping tools, is do we add a nonce? No. Nice try, because the PDU nonce wouldn't be recognized by those non-L3DL speakers. So the storm would propagate. Next slide, please. But this isn't our model. Okay, we don't have a model with all these switches with a dumb switch mesh. Next slide, please. Our model is a clo, a standard clo fabric, and they're all L3DL speakers. Next slide, please. At worst, we might have a switch that wants some fan out one stage, which is why we stuck that one form of switch piercing multicast MAC. Okay, this isn't going to storm. Next slide, please. So, do we actually have a problem? And that's the end.
Comments is because I think it's an edge case. I didn't perceive anything that really needed to be fixed after our discussion with Randy, and I couldn't think of a shortest path bridging or a normal spanning tree topology where this would actually apply. I just thought outside the box, so I'll leave this to Bill and the rest. I didn't think there was a problem because I don't think the scenario I described is something you would normally see. Now that I've shared my evil nightmare, I'll let the rest of you work.
Ron?
Bill?
Just there are other packets like broadcasts that also need to be not create a storm, and multicast is just another instance of this. So you need to have some mechanism, spanning tree, or as Paul said, there are many other mechanisms in your layer 2 to prevent storms. It's not just multicast that has this problem. So to have a layer 2 like this is just to have an invalid layer 2. It's not just this particular multicast that will have a problem. It's broadcast ARPs. It's unicast unlearned flooding. So I think even though we don't need this, we don't want to address this topology because it's not a CLO, we also don't want to address this topology because it's just not a valid layer 2 to run over.
I agree, first of all. There's a hidden issue here, or desire here, which is over in IDR, they're discussing BGP discovery, finding your friends, and their immediate target is the data center. I don't know if they are limiting their definition of data center to be a CLO. As far as I can tell, they're in the expansion and laundry list phase. But I think this probably triggered the, oh my God, what happens when there's all these other devices here? One thing we could do is, by the way, is ignore or actually prohibit the case when there's an intermediate switch and remove that second form of MAC. I'm not advocating it. I'm saying, that certainly shuts off this possibility of discussion.
So one of the things, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the fact, so if you look into the layer 2 topology, what we have here, it's a little bit illegal because it represents a layer 2 environment without, a spanning tree or, some sort of a protocol to do, to manage the multicast and broadcast flooding within the environment, which is a little bit, I think, illegal. It will give problems always. So I think we should, to me, the L3DL should support like multi levels of, of switches, but we should have a flooding mechanisms. That should be a requirement. I think if that actually happens, it should not be. Not that's what I'm thinking.
I think everybody's discussed the fact that topology is not something you want to write home to mother about. But that last statement you made is that L3DL should support multi-layer switching topology, properly configured, of course. Is that really a target for LSVR? And I'm asking you as chair.
From LSVR, I don't think that is the case, but then again, I think L3DL, is a technology which could be used potentially beyond, the LSVR use case. So I don't, I think if we constrain it too far in the applicability at this point in time, then in a later phase we will have to do, more R&D research to expand, the use case from it.
Paul?
Yeah, I was going to respond to your comment about maybe not using the address that passes through switches and using one that terminates at switches like LLDP might. And there's probably a couple of ways that you could do that. First of all, in 802.1, we do have attribute registration protocols that allow you to propagate information like who my neighbor might be or something about somebody across the network like that you showed without flooding and without causing the storm. So there are separate registration protocols that could be leveraged, but perhaps even easier would be to find your own like higher layer entity that propagates information using hop by hop kind of methodology. So in other words, we do this in LLDP as well. You may receive some information on one link, and then you generate an entirely another packet rather than just using the forwarding plane. You use the software plane. You generate another one that goes out the other links that sort of propagates that information. So you could conceivably build some higher layer entity. When I say higher layer, I mean above layer 2. So, some software forwarder, so to speak, that just regenerated the L3DL information and sent it in a whole new packet rather than just flooding it. So anyway, just a couple of thoughts. There's possible ways I think you could do what you were proposing, Randy.
Jeff?
Hi, Randy. Jeff Haas-Juniper. The point from the AutoConf, I suspect, was the genesis for this conversation, but I think it probably still impacts LSVR as well. The observation that we'd left in the documents that we did for AutoConf is yet to figure out what is the scope of the thing you want to talk to. In this case, we're talking about L2, and I think you've nailed the point perfectly fine that if you do something that goes beyond the scope of the thing I'm talking to at the end of this wire to a broader domain, if you have a miswiring in your network, it's potentially problematic. I'm not saying that you should solve that. And
It would
probably
be nice. Some operators have told us one of the things they like about this is it might help them detect miswires. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I agree with you. It's one of the things I do like about L3DL is that it's good plumbing to extend for a lot of things, including this use case. I think that we both realize that if that is part of the core use case, a little bit of additional machinery needs to be added to the protocol.
Gladly discussed.
Thank you.
My forward proposal at the moment is this is not our problem in L3, in LSVR. If people over in IDR want to use L3DL, certainly we can discuss it with them. Somebody feel free to whack me on that.
Okay.
Then I'm done.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thank you, Randy. So let's jump to the next one. I think this is going to be Paul now. So instead of 5 minutes, you actually have 10 minutes, Paul.
Okay. I'm assuming you can hear me okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's been a while since I've given you an update on what we call Project 802.1 ABDH, which we call in 802.1 XLLDP, but we've talked in the past about it being called sort of LLDP version 2. And the main objective here was to allow us to send more information in LLDP than can typically fit in a single frame, but do that in a way that is backward compatible. So I have some, well, first of all, we have an editor who's been developing the draft, Steve Haddock. You may or may not know him. He's been around for quite a while. Excellent editor. And the draft has made quite a bit of progress and is sort of getting to the final stages, if you will. So next slide. Because first of all, this is an individual contribution. This is not an official kind of quote liaison or anything from IEEE 802. This is just me. However, if LSVR was interested, we could do something a little more formal in terms of document sharing and those kind of things. So making it possible for the LSVR group to comment, vote, whatever on the documents. We're typically very liberal about accepting comments from anybody anyway in the earliest phases. Once you get to the final phase, then of course the process is a little bit more tight. But in general, we're open for comment. So next slide. So briefly, this is the I didn't want to get into, I don't have, in 5 or 10 minutes, still not enough to do a lot of technical discussion here. So there have been presentations in the past. I point out that the motivation for originally doing this work came from looking at the requirements that L3DL was satisfying and trying to see if it was time to update LLDP. It's a widely used protocol. There were a lot of people that have augmented it or added additional information, and it really pushed the boundaries when it only allowed you to send a single frame. So the L3DL motivation helped kick us off into this new project in general. So there's some background presentations here. And again, last time we did an update was IETF 106, but nothing really has technically changed since then. I've just got some references to pointers for the project page and the project scope and those kinds of things. You're welcome to read. And then more recently, the sort of technical contributions, as Steve Haddock came in and became editor, he had a couple of questions and he noted a few things. We had resolved those. Those are discussed in here. And there's a paper written by myself and Paul Bottorff, who kind of goes into really more of the details. It's the fundamentals for the draft. So feel free to take a look at those. I think those are all publicly available documents. Next slide. So since the last, the status and since the last IETF, we've completed what we call the working group ballot, first working group ballot, and that was very recently completed. It's kind of roughly equivalent to an IETF last call. And we're resolving those comments now this week, as unfortunately IETF and IEEE overlapped at the same time, so it made it difficult to attend both. But really the changes are we put all the content into the format of a standard. That draft is complete with all the normative text and state machines and conformance. We're using this XLLDP terminology to express the extension of LLDP. It's not necessarily a version 2, because what's important is that a version 1 implementation that's probably already running in the network is capable of communicating with a version 2, but obviously only the first PDU's worth of information. But in that PDU, we defined a new TLV that basically describes a set of extensions, and all that information allows you to send up to like 64 or more PDUs worth of data. And one technical thing that came up, LLDP supports the concept of multiple agents per interface, and really there's different scope. In L2 networks, you might have provider bridges or provider backbone bridges, which are kind of layers of layer 2, if you will. And we want to be able to communicate LLDP messages between different endpoints across that layer 2 topology. And so there's some trickiness in how that works, but we made some clarification of that in the standard. So it's always been there. It's not new support. It's just when we added XLLDP capability, it got a little bit more interesting. So next slide. So the next steps is, again, we're resolving comments on Thursday, I guess it is, this week. And then we'll have what we call a recirculation ballot. If that passes, then it goes to what we call standards association ballot, which is kind of, the equivalent of the end of the road. What would be great is to see an open source implementation. The current LLDP open source implementation would be great to see that augmented to support this. And then, like I mentioned early on, if there's a desire, we can do some liaison and document sharing with Lsvr if that's of interest. We can take that offline to roll those wheels. So if anybody's interested in doing that. So anyway, that's really the update. If there's any questions, happy to take those.
Thank you, Paul. Any questions at all? If not, then we're going to go to the next slot.
I think AC.
Yeah. No, this isn't just a question. It's AC Lindum Cisco. I want to say that I think this is good work. I'm hoping, I recommended that Cisco support this, even though I'm not active in the IEEE. So I'm hoping that happened.
Yeah, we did get your support to make it all happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Randy Boucharkis and
Randy?
Randy
had a
can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Randy.
Hi. I did come over to IEEE and try to help and join this, and nothing much was happening. Things are spinning up again. I again volunteer to help.
Okay. Let me know how we can make that happen. I can. I'll bring that back to the group and mention somehow we can, as an individual, work you in, or again, we can do a more official collaboration.
I'm just an old hippie engineer, so you can wrap whatever you want around it. But email works well.
Okay.
Okay, that's it. Okay, let me go to the last section, to the last slot. And voila. Oops. Okay, here we go.
Let me adjust here. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be presenting one thing. I'm only good. Well, both documents went back to the working group. We focused on the protocol document with the updates we were doing. During starting about Thanksgiving, Kayer, Victor, and I met weekly and went through the comments. Actually, as Gunther said, there are a lot of comments. I think the comments plus the inline draft greatly exceeded the size of the original draft. So we spent quite a bit of time on this, on the first document. The reason we didn't look at the applicability yet is because, why don't you go to the next slide? Because the applicability will be impacted by the change, the protocol. In a lot of places, when we first did this, we thought something with BGP, we said, yeah, we could do this with BGP SPF, but we took out all those things that we could do but didn't fully specify, because we wanted to have a nice tight core protocol that can be augmented with future drafts to do more things with it. A lot of the comments, these are just things we did. We beefed up the error handling. We added the security section with the parts of it that are relevant to BGP SPF. We clarified the relationship to BGP-LS. And, in addition, we've always had the separate address family, but we clarified which NRLI and which attributes we were specifically using in the base protocol. And we also, like I said, we eliminated things in BGP that we said, like for instance, optimized route reflection. We took that out completely. We took out some of the other discussions of 5549 next tops and things like that. And we rewrote the SPF section and used consistent terminology throughout. I think it's a lot easier. I mean, it would be there were actually some mistakes in it too once we did that. So I know the implementations I hope the implementations just said, oh, we know what he means, not, or what the draft means, not what it says, and some other minor nits. Next slide. Yeah, most of the changes were clarifications and things that should have been, where we underspecified. There weren't a lot of changes to the protocol other than the error handling. I mean, that really, Kaya really crisped that up because he's familiar with all the evolution of error handling in BGP, complete with the draft. I forget the number of it that tells what you do whether you ignore an attribute and continue, or whether you take it as an implicit withdrawal or bring down the session. We tried to stay away from that last one, of course. And we put in the code points used by the ARCIS implementation into the IANA section and have requested early allocation of those. Next slide. Now, this is really the key point. There were a number of things we didn't put in yet, but I think most of them are closed. We inherited, because we used BGP, LS, NRLI, we pretty much inherited that you're going to be limited to one NRLI per update, because conceivably you could have a bunch of prefixes that all have the same metric, all the same attributes. But once you start like that, if anything ever changes, you'd have to keep them together because of the sequence number and everything. So I think we're gonna go ahead and say, really, you really only can have one NRLI per update. I'm gonna do initial synchronization last. The next top requirement, crisp that up so it follows the 4760 rules, and I think this issue is closed completely. And the single session requirement, this was from Mel Barrow, but he said, are you limiting it to a single, a separate session for BGP-LS and the other address families? And we can take that. We think we're just going to verify this on the list. We don't think it needs to be, so we're not going to do this. Okay, let me go back to the key one that we're going to discuss. This is the initial synchronization. What Alvaro brought up, which is a really good point, is the IGPs, at least OSPF, has a, you don't advertise a neighbor until you have synchronized with that neighbor, or the link that it's, that you're connected over that link to that neighbor. Now, we're going to add some discussions of this. I guess ISIS has a similar thing that you don't advertise, but it's not mandatory in ISIS. I forget the name of the bit in the ISIS hellos. But anyway, we're going to discuss that further on the list. The one thing that I was thinking, this is just me, I haven't even talked to my co-authors about this, is maybe we could push the route reflector case out, or the controller case, talk about that, what you could do, or whether your mileage will vary or whatever. So that's what's coming. Next slide. Like I said, we did one working group last call. We're going to do another. Once we get this done, we'll start working. Now that we know, we've sort of scoped the base protocol down to what we've fully specified. We're going to work on the applicability as well. And there are now multiple implementations. There's ARCIS and one underway for free range routing. Comments?
Alvaro.
Hey guys, good morning. Alvaro Ratana, Featureware Technologies. I guess speaking as a individual working group participant at this time. I just want to, I guess, if we go back to the last slide, to the slide before this one, insist a little bit on the separate session requirement, or maybe not requirement, considerations, because not only are we carrying different information inside a BGP session, but we're making decisions based on different things, meaning running SPF here versus a decision process in 4271. So the potential dynamics of how the updates get distributed around the network are different from a normal BGP session to a BGP SPF session. So if the working group, so I would, obviously really want to see a requirement for separate session, but what I would settle for is if we could include in the draft, some considerations around, what things could happen, what things to look at in the network. I don't know, congruent topologies, things along those lines. Again, just individual contribution.
I'm going to let, I see Kair's in the queue. I'm going to let him talk to that one.
Super. First of all, Kair Patel's ARCIS, I was going to say Cisco, following AC, but no, Kair Patel ARCIS. One thing I wanted to first acknowledge was that it was a fantastic feedback from Alvaro on the draft. We couldn't have asked for more. And so thank you on that. Particularly on a single and a separate session requirement. To me, we could certainly add some text in the draft, but this is also somewhat an implementation detail, in sense that today certain BGP implementations do allow you to run multiple processes wherein you can listen on a different ports over and above 179. So you could definitely fork this implementation of some different port where you could listen on to, and then it would automatically be a completely separate session. So whether you want to do that or not is a very implementation specific details. A lot of people do it for a lot of different SAFIs, and that's why I think we can add something in draft as a loose text, but we wouldn't want to make it as a requirement. Thank you.
Right, the peering, I mean, yeah, you wouldn't want to have, you know, especially if you're doing the peering model where you're using a session per link. You certainly wouldn't want to have a separate address for peering on two addresses to make them unique.
Yeah, the separate listener port would typically make
Yeah.
that session completely a separate
Yes,
one.
yeah, that'd be a better option.
Thank you.
Thank you. Haibo?
I know what he's asking. I owe him a response on this.
I have a question that I found from the draft 12 version. There are add a new chapter 6.1.1. This I think this actually is like IGP method, but for BGP basic mechanism, the one route originator from itself. It may one key it received from another, perhaps the S loop may be checked, may be used, or otherwise or the originator ID may be used to identify the loop. So I think this scenario perhaps may not be happened in the BGP SPF.
Yeah, I remember this one from the email he sent. What he's talking about is the fact that we have handling of self-originated NRLI, and by self-originated, I don't mean NRLI from your neighbor. I mean NRLI where the node descriptor in the BGPLS NRLI identifies the receiving router, and we do it. And I had added something to do it like the IGPs to speed the convergence in the case. I don't know if we don't think let me talk about that with the co-authors on the list. We can see if we don't need this, but that was added. Yeah, that was added to speed convergence in the event there was stale NRLI. But granted, it should all go away as it permeates from the, you know, from the source, from the originator. Just might take a little bit longer without this.
Okay.
We have a rule that you always, if the this is to cover the case where the router restarts and loses all its state. We have a rule that if you receive NRLI from the originator, you will in fact prefer it, even if it has a lower, a less recent sequence number, to take care of this case. So probably maybe we don't need to discuss the self-originated case. I thought about that as well.
Any more questions, comments? Okay, this is the last slide, AC, or?
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, the Yang model work is in progress. In Kayer and associates are working with it. Are going to work on it. We're sort of, I guess the BGP Yang model has gone through one last call. So it would augment the BGP Yang model in IDR, which is pretty big already with a new address family. Or new SAFI. Well, Kayer, you want to talk to that? Are we going to do all of BGPLS or just what we need for BGP SPF?
We were thinking of doing it just specifically for BGP SPF, but it would be generic enough to extend it to LS eventually. And maybe if we have an agreement, if the chairs have an agreement with the chairs at IDR, then it could be a common draft. But what we don't want is to have a perception that we are taking over IDR's work. So if there is an agreement, we'd love to do it at a common place. I think it makes sense also. But then again, I'll defer that to chairs. I think we should defer them to chairs.
Of which you are one of them from IDR nowadays, so it's going to be easy. Okay. That's it. Victor, you have any last words to say at the end of the session?
Specifically, we'll talk, I guess we'll take that as a output, sort of how we're going to deal with that along with IDR. And then we will be processing some of these updates and we'll let the working group know via mailing list when ready for the next working group last call. Now, AC, one question I had for you is, I guess we have to discuss whether we want to last call the BGP spec before the update to the applicability draft, or if we want to get that revved and then kind of send them both in as a pair. If you don't think it's going to take too long to get the applicability updated, then perhaps doing it at the same time maybe simplify things. Did you have a religion on that?
I don't. No, I don't. I wouldn't mind doing separate cycles, but
Okay, I'll discuss with Gunter offline, and we'll. Oh wait, Alvaro has something to say here.
Hey, Alvaro Tanarati. So I would prefer to, if we're going to publish them both together. That doesn't mean you have to last call them at the same time. They'll progress through my queue, and I'll just push them both together at the end.
Okay. All right, so I'll discuss with Gunter. So we were specifically talking there about how to deal with the working group last fall, but it's understood and noted that when we're ready for publishing, that we put them, that they should go together for simplicity reasons.
Right. So if you send them to me, you can send them to me independently. It doesn't matter. I'll just at the end.
Got it. But you want to go to the ISG once? I understood. For me for now, Gunter.
Okay, I think then I guess we're finished. I know I'll give you back like 8 minutes of time before stepping into the next session. Thank you all.
thanks.
All right.